So, thank you all for joining the Iowa State University Textiles and Clothing Museum Fashion and Justice Speaker Series. My name is Kelly Reddy-Best, and I'm an associate professor in apparel merchandising and design at Iowa State, and also the director and curator of the Textiles and Clothing Museum. In this lecture series, we host fashion studies scholars and museum professionals who consider a social justice lens in their scholarship on dress and fashion. Today, I am pleased to introduce Darnell-Jamal Lisby, who is a fashion historian and assistant curator of the Cleveland Museum of Art. In addition to his understanding of the vast fashion historical field, one concentration is the intersection between Blackness and fashion, using an art historical methodology. He writes for mainstream and scholarly publications and is expanding to various media platforms. He was the lone voice of fashion history on the curatorial team for the Willi Smith Street Couture exhibition at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York City. Having such a strict design mission to adhere to makes efforts as such more difficult to delineate fashion theory and history. In his talk, he will delve into the process he experienced regarding his research and development of the fashion historical content for the exhibition to appease both ends of the spectrum, both design and fashion studies. And without further ado, I'm so pleased to have Darnell here with us today.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and I appreciate it. And hi, everyone. Thank y'all so much for having me. You know, I appreciate this opportunity. I'm actually putting up my timer so that I can check myself because I will go until kingdom come. And so this is just a great opportunity, again, for just to show my process a little bit because I don't really speak on it too much. I just kind of do. And you know, everybody kind of has question marks of like how, and so this is probably a little bit of peek into that process. And as Kelly mentioned, I was asked to come onto the curatorial team at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in the Contemporary Design Department to help curate the Willi Smith Street Couture exhibition about the legendary African-American designer, Willi Smith, and his life as an entrepreneur, as a fashion designer, specifically around his Willi wear practice and all of the different collaborations. So I'll jump into that so I won't waste any time. I'm going to share my screen now and get into it. And so I want this to also be, you know, this is also kind of a lens into, you know, how I've navigated really kind of illuminating fashion studies within kind of non-fashion related museums and institutions. Because even in my role now as assistant curator for the Cleveland Museum of Art, my mandate is to organize, conceptualize fashion-related exhibition programming for the museum. So I work across all the departments in the museum to bring all of those different collections together and talk about the history of fashion as well. So with that said, you know, I'm taking a lot of what I learned at Cooper Hewitt, even though it was a design museum, and bringing a lot of that knowledge here to Cleveland Museum of Art to really kind of help kind of illuminate that side of my process and to bring fashion history into a space that historically never really did fashion exhibitions. And you know, in spite of the fact that Cleveland Museum of Art has, you know, extremely huge name and a lot of prestige, it's never really kind of dived into this nuance solely. And so I'm taking a stab at it here at the museum. And so with that said, I want to take you onto this journey first. While I was at Cooper Hewitt. And so for those who don't know, Willi Smith was, you know, a prolific designer known for his street style clothing in the 1970s and 1980s. He started his Willi wear brand in 1976, but before then, he actually attended Parsons in the late 60s. And he worked for, and after he left Parsons due to, we say left, but he was kind of forced out, but we're not going to get into those nuances. We're going to leave those to the politics of the people at Parsons. But once he left Parsons. He began to work in different Seventh Avenue brands, and eventually he landed at a new brand called Digits between 1969 and 1973. And there he was experimenting with the with what would become the essence of his brand, looking at physically how people were out on the streets and how he could take those elements of how people wore clothes, how people styled themselves, and really create collections, classic collections with traditional and classic silhouettes that they could easily kind of fashion from season to season. And that essentially he created one continuous collection that was completely timeless for his Willi Wear brand. After he left Digits in 1973, he experimented by starting his own line in 1974 with his sister Tukey. That did not end well. He and Tukey are like oil and water, but they loved each other dearly. They decided to quit that venture. He decided to work for another brand called, I believe, Paprika. And then right after that, in 1976, he started Willi Wear with his business partner and best friend, Lori Millet, who is a French merchandiser. She actually came to New York to work with Willi when he was at Digits. And so they both were just Bonnie and Clyde in it basically with this entire brand and turned it into a multi-million-dollar company. They did countless collaborations, and they were looking at working with so many different artists that were known in New York and abroad, and bringing them into the Willi Wear fold and really kind of modernizing how we look at fashion, how audiences perceive fashion, and also, you know, feel it and consume it. And so for Willi, he wanted to make it extremely accessible in every aspect of his brand, whether it was the visual and commercial side, whether it was showing runway or whether it was, you know, the actual physical materials that he was using within his clothes and compositions of his collections. He wanted to make, and also the retail spaces as well. You know, he wanted to create experiences from start to finish to make people feel like they were included within this entire Willi Wear experiment and experience. Here are additional photos. You might see some famous faces, like here in the top, on the photo on the left-hand side, the fall 1985 presentation. At the top right, you see Iman. She was a big muse of Willi Smith. She worked for Willi, she modeled for Willi for a lot of the runway shows in the 1980s. The Willi Smith Street Couture exhibition is almost my bittersweet story because we opened the exhibition the day before the world shut down for COVID. And so we actually opened March 2020, but we had to close it the day after because, of course, the pandemic. And we reopened the exhibition in June of this year, and it just closed in October as it finished its official run that it was supposed to have in 2020. But the only three people that were able to see the exhibition was Iman herself. She came, Beth Ann Hardison, who Willi Smith actually discovered back in the 1970s on the streets of New York City on 7th Avenue. And then Laquan Smith, if you're familiar with any of his recent designs, he's really kind of like a Tom Ford protege. But Laquan Smith also came to the exhibition, which I thought was pretty cool. But they were the only three people who actually got to see the exhibition before it closed. But we were honored to have them both. And then to the right is actually an early Digits fall 1972 campaign. And to the far right is actually Willi's sister, Tukey. So you have a little bit of a reference. And so I have these kind of prompts, and I'm going to move through everything fairly, I'm not as quickly, but quickly, for lack of better terms, and really kind of, again, take you through a little bit of the process that we went through, that we endured while creating this exhibition in a space that isn't the most amenable to fashion in our perspectives as fashion historians, right? And so the first prompt, what is the institutional mission and how can the history of fashion fit within that motive? And so the reality is of any museum institution, they have their mission, they have their motive, they have their plan. They have their stakeholders, all the people that have their hands in the pot that are involved in creating and building and developing that institution. So therefore, how do you move amongst that? And for Cooper Hewitt, it's the National Smithsonian Design Museum. Their mission was to highlight design practice. And for us, of course, fashion historians, we're thinking, oh, fashion design. But for them, they're not thinking about that, actually, even though they kind of include fashion design in that modicum when it's convenient for them. That's neither here nor there, but that's my own opinion. With that said, when they think about design, they're actually thinking about decorative arts. They're thinking about architecture, product design. They're thinking about climate action. They're thinking about sustainable design. They're thinking about landscape design. They're thinking about all of the aspects around you that help you function as a human being. Your bed is designed, right? Your computer is designed. The lamp is designed. Your forks, your knives, your entire house is designed. The roads that you drive on are designed. That's what they're thinking about. They are not thinking about fashion. With that said, their whole kind of mantra is design is supposed to be democratic. Everyone is supposed to use it. So for them, they look for stories, if it's going to fit within the fashion mold, for different opportunities to talk about fashion in a more democratic way. So in a roundabout way, even though their intentions aren't really to show fashion or have a strong need or desire to show fashion or even collect fashion, in a way it forces, historians like myself and any of us to really kind of think about ways in which we can transform things that may seem a little too commercial for us or a little too mass for us, and talk about the democracy of fashion in a more, concrete and a more nuanced way, and bring it into the fold of an institution like Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. And an institution like Cooper Hewitt gives it that platform. And so before we really kind of dove into understanding dove is not a word. Before we dived into understanding the fashion historical ramifications, we kind of had to really understand all of the different design elements. We had to meet the mission where it was. And then through those lenses, then we were able to really kind of tease out all of the fashion historical points that we really wanted to kind of get down to the nitty-gritty in terms of Willi Smith's life. So the first way that we actually was introduced to this particular, to this subject was through his interior spaces. So Willi Smith worked with a collective called Sight. It was an architecture firm. It was led by James Wines and 4 other of his colleagues. The other 4 aren't a part of Sight any longer. James is the only member of Sight that still owns the copyright and trademark to the company. But he was so gracious in working with us. And actually he did the entire set design for the Willi Smith Street Couture exhibition. And he did it in the vein of how he designed the original showroom that he designed for Willi Smith and for the Willi Wear brand back in 1982. Actually, if you're familiar with New York, I believe it's in where Calvin Klein is now. That building is where Willi Smith's showroom eventually was. That was his second showroom, the one that James Wines designed for him. But with that said, when you look at some of the photos, as you can see here, and actually I believe I put them in the next one as well, to the far left, you can see that Willi has all of these different clothes hanging, on the pipes. So for Willi, he wanted to create a space and experience that brought literally the street indoors. Since his clothes were quote unquote, were quote unquote street style, essentially he wanted to have that essence within all of his interiors, from his showroom to his retail spaces, as you can see in the middle for his boutique in Harrods that he had in the 1980s. And eventually he actually opened a store that James Wines designed in New York, but unfortunately he didn't get to experience it because he died. And for those who don't know, he died of AIDS in 1987, but the store was open right after his death. And if you're familiar with New York City geographies, the Sephora down on 19th and 5th Avenue and Lower Fifth Avenue near NYU. That was actually Willi's store, the Willi Wear store, the only Willi Wear store and boutique in New York City. But with that said, he brought a lot of the interiors, exteriors and outside the street, into his interior. So he and James, when they were designing the showroom, they actually went physically to the Chelsea Piers to get, different objects and elements from the piers and bring it physically into the showroom as decorative objects. So cement blocks, pipes, ladders, fences, so on and so forth, to recreate what the New York City streets look like inside. And as you can see with his Harrods boutique in the center, that's what he did. But through all of that, you see clothes, you see how he hung clothes, how he wanted people to feel, when they came into his, to his interiors, to his spaces, they wanted to feel a sense of relaxation. Obviously, when you go to, let's just say, a luxury boutique, let's just take any of them, a Dior, it's a pristine atmosphere. Everything is crisp and sophisticated. Hangers are spread, equally inches apart. You might have a little champagne over here. Glass is everywhere. For Willi, he wanted the complete opposite. He hung his hangers literally right on the fence of all of the designs of his interiors that I think that's important to note. And for us, as we were looking at what he was hanging, that was how the fashion history stories began to really kind of illuminate. To the left, we see, in the photo on the far left, we see, a jumpsuit, and that was really kind of helped us point in the direction of what different items of clothing did Willi love to or enjoy designing for each collection. And there was jumpsuits. And through that lens, I began to research all of his different inspirations, which I have in the upcoming slides, which one of them was workwear and the history of workwear in this country, particularly when you talk about jumpsuits and overalls and coveralls and talking about, how people moved out west. And this became a part of their uniform and their day-to-day lives, whether they were cowboys or whether they were working on the railroads, whether they're working as miners, or whether they're doing any other kind of blue-collar work. These were their uniforms. He wanted to kind of subvert that into day-to-day fashion because he realized people in places like New York or even the suburbs, people had much more active lives. So he wanted to create fashion that was extremely mobile and functional. And so through these kind of lenses of seeing, just here in the architecture alone, we began to pull out a lot of these different fashion history stories. Additionally, there are additional entry points and access points to fashion in terms of his collaborations, and one of which were his dance collaborations. Here we have the Secret Pastures performance that was choreographed by the Bill T. Jones Arnie Zane Dance Company. That was led by obviously Bill T. Jones and his late partner Arnie Zane. It was in 1984. And this was a production that was done for the Brooklyn Academy of Music. The music was composed by Peter Gordon, and the set design was by, if you're familiar with the artistic aesthetic of the tent behind the dancers here, as you can see, Keith Haring. And in the exhibition, I think I have it in the next, I have a little bit of the tent that actually traveled. This was not the tent that you see to the left that was in the original performance. The performance eventually traveled around the country, and this was the tent that was used. And then later on in the film, you don't see it here, later on in the performance, there was a big tarp that was brought out on stage, and that was actually the actual tarp that was used in the performance. But with that said, for Willi, he was tasked with creating the costumes for this performance. And funny enough, the costumes didn't really look too different from what he was designing for his runway shows. As you can see in the middle, here's Arnie Zane in one of his, to the middle left, Arnie Zane with one of his dancers. But then to the far left, you have the Suburban 1984 collection promotional photos. And literally, it's like identical what he was doing from the runway to costume design, because he wanted to visually show people that one wasn't different from another. He was inspired by dance. He was inspired by movement. He was inspired by the activeness of what people of how people were going about their lives and living their lives. He was inspired by the energy of the time. It was the 1970s and 80s. So we're talking about the era of disco. You know, and Willi was definitely a person who loved to be out in the streets. And he loved to have a little fun. So he was definitely getting a lot of ephemera from all of his, you know, adventures and bringing them into his showroom. And so with that said, when you see a performance like Secret Pastures and all of the different costumes, as you can see here's a broader view of more of the costumes, you know, one influenced the other. It was a whole kind of symbiotic relationship between all of his collaborations and what he was designing for them and what he was doing on the runway. It was all one and the same for Willi Smith. It wasn't, you know, I'm going to create this separate entire new, I don't know, this new kind of aesthetic for what I'm doing over here. It was all one and the same for him. And that's how we began to kind of tease out all those fashion historical elements for the exhibition. It really kind of hit home to that element because honestly, we did not have much to go on when it came to Willi Smith's story. There wasn't anything written about him extensively. And it was really kind of started from scratch and looking at all of the ephemera, but also leaning into the actual mission of Cooper Hewitt, that design mission, you know, that idea that how is this designer affecting all of the aspects of one's life? And how are they creating things for everybody? And so through those kind of lenses, we were able to kind of create this fashion historical voice throughout the exhibition. Additional collaborations that we're looking to, Christo and Jean-Claude, he created workwear, again to that workwear inspiration. This only added to what we already knew at this point in time when it came to Christo and Jean-Claude and in his collaboration with Willi Smith. And if you're familiar with Christo and Jean-Claude, they did these big rap projects in the 1980s and 1970s and after, all around the world. Willi designed the workwear uniforms for the workers who were helping Christo and Jean-Claude do these rap projects, including the workwear uniforms for the Surrounded Islands Miami project in 1983, and then the Pont Neuf rap project the following year when they wrapped the Pont Neuf Bridge in Paris. And if you can see actually up closely, the workers look like they're wearing like almost design smocks, like something that you would see in an atelier, all of the, you know, seamstresses or dressmakers, you would see them wear something very similar. And he was pulling from that inspiration of like, oh, we're going to Paris, so why don't I pull, you know, that kind of Parisian essence into what I'm creating, something that's easy and simple and that's mobile. And it essentially was almost like a token of a goodwill token to the workers themselves, that they could have like a parting gift of a piece of Willi that they could take home with them, which I thought was pretty cool as well. And so another element with the next prompt, you know, what I always advise, especially in these times when, you know, I feel like fashion is going beyond museums with just fashion collections, as obviously I'm an example of that, you know, going to Cooper Hewitt and then now here at the Cleveland Museum of Art, you know, it's crazy to me because I think it's incredible and it's dynamic that so many institutions that aren't traditionally tuned into the fashion historical canon or dress or textiles in that way, in the way that we see it, are trying to move into that space because they see how valuable it is to their institutions. But when you're creating an exhibition really from scratch in an institution with a mission that is really kind of the opposite of how we think as fashion historians, I suggest, you know, get creative with your research, because resources exist beyond Google and ProQuest. You know, for us, you know, we built this exhibition not only on the ephemera that we pulled in terms of the design collaborations that Willi Smith did, we created we built this exhibition based on the stories that were told from all the people that we talked to that knew and loved Willi Smith, from his brother, Norman Smith, and his sister-in-law, Alma, Willi's sister-in-law, Norman's wife, Alma, who both worked for Willi at one point in time when he was alive. We talked also to so many different collaborators. We talked to, obviously, James Rines. We talked with Peter Gordon. We talked with Bill T. Jones. We talked with Lori Millay, his business partner, who I mentioned. We talked to Jeffrey Banks, who was a good friend of his. If you're familiar with the rise of Black designers in the 1970s, Jeffrey Banks is right along with them. Stephen Burrows was one of Willi's good friends, and he had such lovely things to say. Pat Cleveland, who modeled for Willi Smith all the time, said a lot of wonderful words about Willi. And we really built all of these stories, Beth Ann Hardison, of course. We built all of these stories about Willi through the voices of all these people that loved Willi. And we began to kind of connect the dots. We began to kind of realize, okay, well, if this happened at this time, then this happened at this time, then these people were here at this event. And things started to make a lot of sense. Through all of these different stories, we were able to really kind of flesh out how impactful Willi was to, you know, 7th Avenue, and this idea of creating this new space in fashion that no one was really talking about, you know, that functional and fashionable aspects. And sure, some designers tackled, but Willi was looking at creating a model, a business model that really reached, you know, an international audience. He created a business model that used avant-garde art and contemporary art practice within his approach. He was using different inspirations, artistic and art historical inspirations as a basis of his brand, but also not sacrificing his mission of creating affordable clothing. And so for us, that was really important to get towards. And so getting creative with our research really helped us, really helped me specifically illuminate more of a fashion historical perspective within this design museum. And also, sidebar, you can go to the Willi Smith Community Archive, which is online, it's at, you know, accessible for everyone. And I'm sorry, it's accessible to everyone. And with that said, you are more than welcome to go onto it, and you will be able to see all of these different stories, all of these different remembrances. And also, I have the book here right behind me. You can buy the book from Cooper Hewitt's website. But if you don't have the financial access to do so, we actually put all of the written chapters from the book, which I also contributed to, on this online community, Willi Smith Community Archive. So you're more than welcome to see all the research that we did and all of the different voices, academic and personal voices that contributed to the Willi Smith Street Couture exhibition. So now that there's an opportunity to delineate a fashion historical narrative, as we began to understand through all of these different design collaborations, how can you reshape the way the canon was previously expressed? So essentially, you know, we look through specific lenses as fashion historians. There's certain things that we jump to first. And so for this exhibition, we couldn't really do that. We had to kind of be even more creative with how we approach this, because we're not talking about fashion with the capital F. We're not talking about couture. We're not talking about, you know, your big wigs like your Dior and, you know, Balenciaga and, you know, your very classic traditional, you know, ideologues of, you know, fashion design and the history of fashion. We're talking about commercial clothing. You know, very quotidian clothing, as Alvin Bell, who is Willi Smith's best friend from Philadelphia, who also contributed, would say about Willi's clothes. It was very quotidian, very day to day. And so, trying to take that nuance and make it, for lack of better terms, high art or transcendent was a challenge. But we tried to meet the challenge where it was. And through that, we began to pick apart a lot of the inspirations, really kind of hold them up to the same standard as we would any other design, entry point, access point that anyone else would do, And so for us, one of the major points that we wanted to kind of drive home is, Willi's inspiration of the streets of the city. He wanted to dress for everyone, from people in the suburbs to people in the hood. He was inspired by women who were, going to church in Harlem. He was inspired by people in the day-to-day that were walking in front of him and just living their lives, and the grunge look that was all surrounding him. He was inspired by the energy. He wanted to infuse all of that within his aesthetic, from process to presentation. And so for Willi, for instance, he only used natural fibers. He only worked in cotton, linen, and wool. For the most part, and silk every now and then. And he did that for every single season. He, when you talk about sustainability, he was kind of thinking about that, inadvertently, almost subconsciously, with this brand, because he also wanted you to purchase something, which he definitely invested a lot of quality into his clothing. And people, we talked to so many different people about Willi Smith. They would be like, oh, I used to have my Willi wear, but I wore it to death. That was what Willi wanted you to do. He wanted you to wear it until it just shredded, and that's what Willi wanted. And if he were alive today, he probably would have had like a buyback program, give your old Willi wear, and probably would have recycled it to make new clothes. He was thinking about all of those different types of things back when he was at the height of his career, and really kind of creating consciously produced clothing, but also inexpensive clothing. He said nothing over $150. And so for Willi, he wanted to stay true to that. He was not going to sell you some couture piece. I mean, he did do an evening wear line, but even that, I believe, was very inexpensive. It was just still didn't hit his cap of $150. But he wanted to just kind of manipulate fabrics and play around and make sure that he was creating things that people could style themselves, whether it was, a large cable knit oversized sweater in a skirt set, as you can see to the left, or, in the center, you have the wax denim trench coat, all of these different elements. He was looking at as saying, you know what, I'm just going to invest in all of these different inspirations, but then I'll put them together to have clothing that people can just meticulously just style for themselves. That's what he believed in. He wasn't about telling people how to wear things and what to wear. He just said, here's the product and do what you want with it. And that was really kind of the essence of the streets that was very much integral to him, because people call him the father of streetwear, but we have to kind of dive into what that means. And this was actually where the kind of funny nuances kind of came into play. We had to define what is streetwear, because we use that very loosely today. We kind of attribute it to specifically Black designers who have some kind of athleisure crossover, when in reality, that is not what it is. Streetwear is just street associated to a specific bubble and experience. So, if everybody is wearing clogs, jeans, and, Nike t-shirts in, Edmonton, Canada or something, that's streetwear to those people. If people are wearing, Valentino gowns in Nova Scotia, or Antarctica, that's streetwear to those people. Streetwear is not a term that originally that is this, element that streetwear in its nascence was never intended to be, something specific to a particular class of people. or to an experience. Eventually, it became associated to the Black experience as hip hop began to ensue in the late 1970s into the 1980s. And so you had the rise of people like April Walker, who admired Willi Smith and named her brand Walker Wear in honor of Willi Wear, or Jeff Tweedy, who actually worked for Willi Smith. He actually went on to be the CEO of Sean John and start Sean John with Puff Daddy, but he worked for Willi Smith as a merchandiser. But you have those kind of direct links in that element, in that world of streetwear, sure, but that's not necessarily the end all be all of what streetwear can be considered as. And I think that's where we kind of have to continuously expand our thinking around these terms. Today, of course, the commercial success of calling something streetwear kind of precedes all, but the reality is streetwear is just something that's associated to your lived experience, and that's common between all of the people that are around you in that bubble that you live in. And for Willi, his bubble was New York City, so this is what he produced. He was inspired by South Asian dress. He manufactured actually out in India, and he loved using Indian cotton specifically. He was always out there, for leisure vacations before he started Willi Wear, and he was just invested in the communities there. And for Willi, he wanted to kind of bring a lot of those elements back because he saw the ease in a lot of their clothing. In South Asian dress and Southeast Asian dress. He saw the ease in their clothing, the movement. And he said, well, that movement is something that we face here in the United States. People are so mobile. So how can we translate that into clothing that people can easily switch in and out with what with whatever they're wearing on a given day? And he successfully did that. So if you see the spring 1978 collection in the center, that he premiered, you see those elements of South Asian dress within his collection. He created pants, Jodhpur pants. He had these kind of Charlie sets, that he created for, or Charlie-like sets that he created for that collection specifically. But he wanted to illuminate his experiences, his worldly experiences, to everyone. And so this is how he lived. This is his whole life. And so he wanted to kind of use his brand to, in a way, I guess, bring people together, bring different worlds and bring different cultures together. Because again, he was living in New York City, a very diverse place, and his experiences were extremely well-traveled. And so he wanted to invest that within how, he wanted other people to see him, but then also in how we see each other. We talked about workwear. I'm going to keep it moving, but he was also invested in his Blackness specifically. This was a journey for him. And it was a tricky journey. It was a tricky journey for him and a lot of other Black designers at the time. Even when we talk to Black designers, creatives, models from the 1970s, they all talk about their Blackness very similarly. Because the reality was at the time, they're all children of the civil rights movement, right? And so they were face to face with a lot of the oppression of the day. So fashion for them was escapism. And so to escape from that and not to think about that was just, it helped them get them through. And so for Willi, he did not like the fact that he was always typecast and categorized as like, oh, he and the other Black designers. And he didn't like that for his colleagues either, and his friends and his peers. He wanted them to be seen for their merit, because obviously when you look at white designers historically, you're not saying, oh, those white designers. You just say Karl Lagerfeld. You don't say those white designers. You say Christian Dior. You don't even mention his race. You just know. But for a lot of the Black designers, that wasn't the case. And he certainly was obviously very ahead of his time in understanding that. But, it's, even though that was the case, he still was on this journey of discovering and uncovering his Blackness and exploring that privately. He was an avid art collector. He collected a lot of Black artists as well, contemporary Black artists. He was he loved Basquiat. But And he also collected a lot of African art as well. But in 1985, he did something, well, he was doing little bits and pieces of, showing and celebrating his Blackness in different ways. But this was really in 1985 for his spring 1986 collection, which he entitled Expedition. He did something that was quite different, which I believe is the next slide. No, it's a little further away, but he decided to, which you'll see in a few moments, he decided to do a fashion film in Dakar, Senegal, and use the Dance Sarongo Theater dancers as extras for a fashion film that he produced and directed with Max Fiduco. And he designed all of the clothing and inspiration of Bogolonfini textiles. And so for him, this was really kind of his, say it loud, say it proud, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud kind of moment that he used or that he showed and delineated through this particular collection. And as I mentioned, there were different elements that he did this throughout his career. And another one is actually on the Willi Smith online archive, as well as the book. You'll find an interview that I did with costume designer Ruth Carter, who we worked together before. And she didn't mention this to me, but at the time, but I found out, and that's why I wanted to interview her. And it was such a great interview, and I encourage you to read it. But she designed obviously, she's a prolific costume designer, Academy Award winning. She designed Black Panther, and really kind of any of the biggest movies in the last 30 years. School Days was her first costume design initiative. If you're not familiar with School Days, it was a film about that Spike Lee did, his second film, I believe. And it was portraying, HBCU life and all of the kind of intercultural kind of dynamics that we as Black people go through, specifically on these campuses, and also take a larger peek at what was going on in the Black community as well. And Ruth Carter costume designed for that film, and Spike asked if Ruth could work with Willi Smith to design the homecoming court costumes for the homecoming section of the film, and Willi Smith did, and this is what the product to the right of that collaboration. And so leaning into this last part, what extensions can one explore that are a part of the fashion purview and add to the understanding of physical garment or general fashion practice? So what I mean by this is kind of also extending in the first aspect, when we're looking at a subject like this that isn't, couture related, because it's easy when you're doing an exhibition, about haute couture. You can easily just put up a beautiful gown and you call it a day, and people will be amazed. But something that's so commercial and extremely accessible, not only for the people at the time, if you're talking about the story, but also the audience, the actual physical audience that will visit these exhibitions, it gets a little tricky. You have to kind of continue to tease out everything, every aspect of the story to kind of elevate that story into this kind of artistic realm of these institutions. And one of the ways that we did that were through all of the different fashion extensions of his brand, like patterns. Willi Smith designed these amazing patterns for Butterick and McCall's. Another kind of one of my major contributions to the book and to the project was the story of patterns, and how, again, much like his collaborations, they were all kind of cohesively designed with what he was creating at that given moment. So if you look at the collections that he was doing in 1976, you'll see the very similar designs here. And what he wanted to do was say, look, even though my clothes are extremely accessible, they're very inexpensive, I know there's still people who can't even afford that. So here's something else that they can create. They can go out, get their own fabric, here's the pattern, and they can create their own style for themselves. And there was a religious following around Willi Smith's patterns, even till today, which I find quite fascinating. Even in the far right, you have the 1984 McCall's pattern that he did, because he was working with Butterick first, and then he went to work with McCall's afterwards. By 1982, that collection specifically looks like his City Island collection for spring 1984, if you look at the side-by-side comparisons. And here's some additional. And here's Expedition film. And so with Expedition film, here are different shots of it. This was something that was very avant-garde for the time. Fashion designers were not really moving into that film space so heavily. They were still looking to that very traditional Paris, European type of style fashion show. And Willi said, you know what, bump it. I'm going to do a film, and I'm going to bring fashion to life and bring it in a more caricature way. Willi, this was during the MTV era, right? Like Michael Jackson and Thriller. Like, this was the big time where people were looking at all these visual mediums, and he wanted to bring those visual mediums into fashion in a way so that people can kind of create an association with what they know with something that they don't. And so if they didn't know Willi, now they knew Willi, and they could easily kind of munch on all of the Willi wear aesthetic and really kind of receive it and consume it much better than probably a lot of his contemporaries at the time, which put him in a lot of the conversations with people like Perry Ellis and Calvin Klein, and a lot of articles that we read in Ralph Lauren. If he were alive today, I think he would have had just as successful of a brand, because he was doing the exact same things, but in his own spin, and definitely in a much more dynamic approach. Here are additional shots. And then runway, of course. He loved dance. He loved to dance. He loved dance. He had the models dance. This is actually funny. The spring 1979 collection runway show was actually done at FIT at the Katie Murphy Amphitheater. I noticed, obviously, I went to FIT, and I was like, I looked at these photos, like, those look so familiar. I know that stage. And I went to our special collections curator, April Callahan. I was like, is that Katie Murphy? She was like, that is Katie Murphy. And so that's our Katie Murphy Amphitheater. I thought that was kind of cool, because I believe Willi Smith also taught at FIT for a short time, as well as Parsons, but I thought that kind of relationship was cool. But for Willi, runway was everything that could connect, the audience to his aesthetic in a very direct way, but using all of the incredible kind of art resources at his disposal. There was the digital art that he loved to use. He had, if you can see on the left, for his City Island spring 1984 collection runway show, you see all the TVs around. He had Namjoon Paik, who's the legendary digital artist, come and design that for him. And it was just kind of like it's bonkers. All of the video going on at the same time. It was a very kind of psychedelic experience, but it was right for the time. You can actually see the runway on this show on the Willi Smith Online Archive also, by the way. And then here, lastly, we have the artist t-shirts, this other element of, Willi Smith that, we don't really talk about too much. But we decided to talk about it in this exhibition. And it is a fashion story because it connects to things that we take for granted today. This idea of Kanye West doing a shoe drop at Dover Street Market, or Virgil Abloh doing a shoe drop, or Pierre Moss and Kirby John Raymond doing this drop, or, Beyonce doing a Adidas Ivy Park drop, or Fenty doing a drop. Willi was already thinking about that. He did kind of what I think was the earliest form of a drop in his artist t-shirt project, where he collaborated with all of the prolific artists of the day, like Armand, Dondi, Suzanne Pitt, Christian Jean-Claude, James Wines, Keith Haring, Robert Rauschenberg, Gilbert and George, to design t-shirts that he would then put on canvases and sell to people who come to his openings. He did an opening at the Feldman Gallery and then also the area nightclub, and people would buy it for cheap. They were like, here's, a piece of Willi Smith and a canvas, for you to keep, and also a piece of that artist. It also reminds me of H&M when they do those big kind of designer collaborations with these like luxury houses. You get a piece of Balmain or a piece of Karl Lagerfeld for a very inexpensive price. Willi Smith was thinking about that here. So in all of those different ways, you know, just being more critical and finding the nuances in all of these different stories through the lenses of even the museum mission can really illuminate the fashion historical perspectives really that you may want to lean into, and that may bring a whole new layer to the canon that we might not have ever even thought about doing. And so that's what I want to leave you all with today.